Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. Today's story is about what happens when politeness is mistaken for permission. A routine retail shift turns into an uncomfortable endurance test after a customer decides the employee behind the counter should provide transportation, financial help, and even free labor, whether they agree to it or not. But before we begin, best way to support our channel is to leave comments, like, and subscribe with a turned-on bell so you don't miss the new video every single day. Here we go. The most entitled customer I've ever had didn't want to buy a phone. She wanted a chauffeur, a secretary, and for me to ignore the spit flying in my face. I work at a semi-major phone retailer. I had about an hour left to finish my 9-hour shift. This woman comes in and sits down. I ask her, how can I help her? And she asks what time I leave. I was confused, but figured she was waiting for someone. After I tell her, she immediately asks if I can give her a ride home. I don't even own a car, and my dad usually picks me up since I live 5 minutes away, but I didn't tell her that because she sounded so entitled. I knew she'd tell me to tell my dad to give her a ride. Instead, I tell her I live close and that I always get an Uber. She asks if she can ride in the Uber with me. Thinking she lives close at this point, I ask where she lives. She lives 20 minutes away. I said, sorry, but I can't do that. She asks how Uber works. I tell her she needs a card, but she didn't have one. I tell her to get a taxi, but she doesn't have any cash because she just got her hair done. At this point, I realize she actually wanted me to pay for her Uber ride, LOL. She says she'll get picked up by her daughter at 9 p.m. This was around 6 p.m. Let me also add, she's the type that doesn't know how to talk. She talks at a yelling level with all the spit-throwing thing going on. She proceeds to talk on the phone at an even higher level for around 15 minutes inside the store. I couldn't even hear a customer that came in. Very annoying stuff. The customer leaves and she hangs up. That's when she told, not asked me to get a job application for her. I pointed at the cameras and said my boss is watching and I would get in trouble. Oh, he won't find out. Just pretend you're using your phone, she says. She dragged a chair right next to me, puts her phone in my hands, and tells me to look up on Google for said job. I acted like I didn't know what to do. This woman proceeds to call the manager of the place she wanted to work at so he could tell me step by step how to do it. She wouldn't leave me alone, so I just did it. Whole time she'd swayed a super close proximity to me, and it was very uncomfortable. She ended up taking a long time getting her email and social security number that it came time for me to close the store. I told her she had to finish it herself because I had stuff to do before closing. I close at 7 p.m. It was 6:55 at this time. She kept insisting I finish, that it would just take a few minutes. I just stood up to close the store and told her she had to leave. I was at my limit. She leaves but stands just outside the store. My dad arrives to pick me up and I finished closing up. She caught me outside, still insisting I finish. I said, my Uber's here and get inside the car. She's flagging me down still, signaling my dad to pull down the window. I tell my dad to ignore her and just leave. And what do you know? The store's located in a plaza. So at the end of it, I see her get inside a car through the passenger seat. She had a ride right there for who knows how long. At least I learned not to be a doormat for strangers next time. Edit. I've seen some comments saying she must have been on drugs or having mental health issues, but surprisingly, she didn't seem to have either. I live in the city. I've seen my fair share of homeless people with both those issues. She seemed normal and sober to me, to be honest. I also want to mention that it's a tiny plaza, so no security, unfortunately. Lastly, I didn't include every single thing to avoid making the post too long, but she also insisted that I explain parts of her application, like the WOTC section and why they would need certain information. When I said I didn't know, she said, what? You should know. You've done job applications before. Just explain it so I can understand. And yes, she kept spitting on me every time she talked as she was inches away from me. She tested limits over and over. Volume, time, physical distance, rules, authority. She ignored cameras, ignored your job, ignored closing time, ignored your body language. People like this don't need to be on something to be a problem. Sometimes they're just very comfortable treating other people as tools. And our next story. Some people buy a house and think they own the neighborhood. Our response to an unsolicited landscaping rant was laughter and a flower revolution. When we bought our house, it came with one very obvious flaw: a ridiculous hill. The house sat up high, and one entire side dropped straight down to a narrow side road at a steep, awkward angle. It wasn't just annoying to mow, it was borderline impossible. One wrong step and you'd be tumbling into traffic like a poorly planned stunt. A couple of weeks after moving in, my husband and I were outside standing at the top of the hill, hands on hips, doing that new homeowner thing where you squint at a problem and pretend you already have a plan. We were tossing around ideas: ground cover, rocks, maybe something low maintenance that didn't require risking our lives with a lawnmower every weekend. That's when the neighbor across the road appeared. He didn't wave, he didn't introduce himself, he didn't even do that fake polite cough people use before speaking. He just marched over, planted himself halfway onto our property, and launched straight into a rant. "You can't plant anything on that hill except grass," he announced, pointing like he owned the deed. "Anything else will attract rats, and I'm not putting up with rats because of new neighbors." No hello, no name, just rats. My husband and I both froze for a second, genuinely unsure if this was real life or some kind of weird neighborhood initiation. Then something in my brain snapped, and I started laughing. Not a polite chuckle, full-on, can't-stop-it laughter. The old man glared at me. "What's so funny?" I tried to stop, I really did, but the sheer audacity of a stranger stepping onto our property to lecture us about hypothetical rodents broke something inside me. I just kept laughing harder. Before I could say anything truly unfiltered, my husband stepped in. He smiled in that very calm way that means he's absolutely not calm at all. "I think it's best you go back across the road," he said, "because I'm pretty sure my wife is about to tell you exactly where you can stick your opinions." The neighbor huffed, muttered something about people these days, and stomped back to his side of the road like we'd personally ruined his afternoon. We stood there in silence for a moment after he left. "Well," I said, wiping tears from my eyes, "I guess we know what not to plant." That winter, we did our research. We learned about native ground cover, erosion control, and plants that actually thrive on steep slopes. By spring, we'd covered the entire hill in creeping phlox. No grass, no mower, just dense, low-growing greenery that exploded into bright flowers when the weather warmed up. It was stunning. Pink and purple blooms cascading down the hill like something out of a gardening magazine. Neighbors slowed down when they drove past. People walking their dogs stopped to look. One woman knocked on our door just to ask what we'd planted because she wanted to do the same thing. Across the road, the old man watched. Every spring after that, the hill bloomed again, and every spring he'd stand there, arms crossed, staring at it like the flowers had personally betrayed him. Here's the funny part. The rats never came. Not one. No infestation, no scurrying hordes, no dramatic calls to pest control. Just flowers, bees, butterflies, and a hill that finally stopped being a death trap. A few years later, I overheard him complaining to another neighbor about how that hill should have stayed grass. I smiled and kept walking. The hill's still covered in phlox, we still don't mow it, and every time it blooms, I think about that first interaction and how some people truly believe that buying a house gives them authority over everyone else's property. Turns out the only thing our plants attracted was compliments. And apparently a lifetime supply of quiet rage from one very loud old man. I love how he didn't even pretend to ask. He just walked onto your property and started issuing rules like he was updating zoning laws. And of course, it's always rats. It's never erosion, safety, or maintenance. It's some vague nightmare scenario they can't prove. The laughing probably hurt more than the yelling ever would. And our next story. I bankrupted their company. The supervisor now works drive-through. I was working at a metal manufacturing plant that made appliance faces, washing machines, dryers, that sort of thing, and wire shelving for refrigerators. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady, and more importantly, it paid reliably. At that point in my life, that mattered more than pride. I'd been hired just before Thanksgiving of 2003, only a few months after my daughter was born in July. The timing wasn't great. There was an ongoing strike at the plant, and I came in as a replacement worker. Normally, I would have walked right past a picket line, but not everyone had walked out, and I had a newborn at home. Ideals don't buy diapers, formula, or heat in the winter. Despite the circumstances, I actually liked the job. Most nights were predictable. I ran a welding machine, building wire shelving frames piece by piece, stacking them, packing them into crates, and sending them off to the paint department for powder coating. It was repetitive, but once you got into a rhythm, it was almost relaxing. Clock in, do the work, clock out. No drama, no surprises. That changed the night the rod-cutting machine went down hard. Engineering took one look at it and said parts would take at least a week, maybe 2. Production couldn't stop, so people got shuffled around, and I was sent over to help on the 12-ton stamping press. That machine was a different animal altogether. It used massive steel dies, moved into place with a forklift, and then bolted down by hand. To reach the upper bolts, we used a rolling staircase ladder, metal frame, handrails, wheels at the base. The wheels were supposed to retract and lock when weight was applied. They didn't. Everyone knew it. We'd complained about it more than once. The wheels would randomly pop back out even when someone was halfway up. Maintenance took a look, slapped a new safety tag on it, and declared it fine, safe, good to go. It wasn't. I was up there one night tightening the top bolts on an open die when the ladder betrayed me. The wheels kicked out without warning. The ladder shot one way, I went the other. I flipped over the rail, clipped the edge of the open die with my right shoulder, then dropped 9 feet straight down onto concrete, landing on that same shoulder. I don't remember hitting the ground so much as suddenly being there. I lay in scrap metal and oil, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what still worked. Everything felt distant and unreal at first, like my body hadn't caught up yet. My partner Shields came running over and helped me sit up. He took one look at my shoulder, stepped back, and said quietly, "Oh, F." That's when the pain arrived. It rolled in slow, heavy waves. I turned my head and saw my shoulder shoved forward in a way shoulders absolutely aren't meant to go. It looked wrong. It felt worse. We walked over to the supervisor together. He glanced at my shoulder, reached out, and actually pushed on it. "It's just muscles you haven't used before," he said. Shields exploded. "What the F is wrong with you?" I stayed calm, but only barely. "You bald-headed idiot," I said. "Did the sun finally cook your brain, or was it the paint fumes? I need to go to the hospital." He sighed like I was inconveniencing him, then reluctantly agreed. He docked me a point for leaving early and told me to drive myself. I drove home in a manual transmission car using one arm, fighting back nausea every time I shifted. Hours later, the ER reduced the dislocation, pumped me full of painkillers and muscle relaxers, and sent me home with my arm immobilized. The next morning, I went straight to HR, sling and all. They sent me to the company doctor and then sent me home again. The doctor ordered an MRI and took me off work until the results came back. The MRI showed damage, not minor damage. Physical therapy followed anyway. It didn't help. My shoulder kept slipping out of place and slamming back in. Sometimes it fully dislocated. Sometimes it half did. Either way, it hurt constantly. Eventually, work called me back in on what they called light duty. I showed up in a sling, foggy from prescribed narcotics. They told me they wanted me inspecting machines while they were running and sweeping around active equipment. I told them flat out I wasn't comfortable doing that. I was medicated and unsteady, and machines don't care if you're hurt. "Well," they said, "we're not paying you to sit at home exaggerating your injury." I asked if they'd even read the doctor's report. They hadn't. Apparently, trusting their own doctor was optional. They started me sweeping open floor space. When that ran out, I helped QA, measuring parts, filling out paperwork, checking tolerances. I was useful, productive, too productive. So they took away the work. They sat me on a bar stool in the middle of the production floor, near management's desks. No desk, no paperwork, no book, no pen, nothing. Just sitting there, in a sling, like a kid in timeout. By then, my original supervisor was gone and replaced by the same guy who hired me originally. One time I stood up to go to the bathroom and he started yelling. I looked at him and asked, "Are you done?" He sneered, "You're hurt, right? Boo-hoo, that's why you're here." The next night, I came in wearing a homemade dunce cap and holding a sign that read, "Being punished for getting injured." HR said they couldn't do anything. They couldn't pay me to sit at home. Apparently, humiliating me at work was perfectly acceptable. So I wore it all night. About 3 weeks into this circus, the supervisor ordered me to sort parts coming off a conveyor next to a stamping machine. It required 2 hands. I reminded him my arm was in a sling. "Make do," he said, "or you're fired." 5 hours later, compensating left-handed, I tore muscles in my neck, back, and left arm. He screamed at me, dragged me to the ER, dropped me off, and left. I had to call my mother to pick me up while still doped up on pain injections. The next day, HR fired me for pointing out and being on drugs. I'd never missed a shift except for medical appointments. Even then, I came in afterward. I was beyond angry. Surgery followed, rehab, paperwork, a lawyer. I was finally cleared as healed. Then one day, at home, I stood up holding my daughter in my left arm and pushed off the couch with my right. My shoulder exploded backward this time. I cracked my head on the entertainment center hard enough to bleed. Back to the ER. They told me the damage looked extensive and tied to the original injury. The company doctor accused me of taking advantage of him, ripped off my sling, threw it in the trash, and said there was nothing wrong with me. The next day, my mother walked me into a lawyer's office. 2 days later, a real doctor showed me the scans. The damage had been there all along. The first surgery had been half-butted. I needed another one immediately. The company fought it, lost. I ended up with 3 anchors holding my shoulder together, permanent nerve damage, lifetime checkups. The lawsuit settled deep into 6 figures against both the company and the doctor. 5 months later, the company declared bankruptcy and shut down. The supervisor tried to get hired at another plant. My friend worked there and knew exactly who he was. No job. Last I saw him, he was working fast food. All of this could have been avoided if they'd fixed a ladder and treated me like a human being instead of a liability they thought they could bully into quitting. The physical injury's awful, but what stuck with me was the humiliation. The stool, the yelling when you stood up, being treated like a liar while visibly injured. That's the kind of thing that stays with you longer than scars. They weren't trying to manage risk. They were trying to break your dignity so you'd quit and save them money. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.